Well, first of all, I think in terms of privacy, we now live in an age where that is totally being redefined. That essentially privacy is obsolete, whether you want to admit it or not. That is the fact. We now live in an age where data is constantly being collected by us, and that privacy is no longer the norm. And we feel on a personal level, if you today were to tell someone that you have no presence on social media, they would stare at you in a very weird way. People expect, yes, at least even from a sociological standpoint, that you have data out there on the net. And of course, data is actively being collected by our phones, by our devices. It's all automatically built into the terms and agreements, and we're basically okay with it. It's gotten to a stage where we're not even reading these things. We more or less accept it because, again, we're also being sold the idea that this data will lead to better efficiencies for us in terms of what companies can do. So I think the first thing in terms of addressing what you mentioned is this idea that I think privacy is dead, whether you want to admit it or not. It's no longer normative. It's no longer the norm. And it's hard to imagine privacy ever being a thing before. Technology has more or less driven the death of privacy in terms of what it's able to do in terms of collecting data. But in terms of the question of data being integrated into these machines that are able to pick them up, process them in such an incredible and exponential way, you're quite right. It is imaginable at some point that they can truly become highly, highly intelligent. And the question of whether we should allow it to develop of its own way, in its own way, and totally not supervise it, but giving it essentially, I think what you're referring to, the idea of it has a right to learn, to me personally is quite scary. I think although privacy is no longer normative, and of course a lot of the developments happening at the moment are happening in an unhindered way, but I think there still needs to be at least an element of human supervision, especially in how these AIs are not only developed but applied. Because one thing we mentioned earlier in the call is this idea of it potentially being used in a nefarious way. And I think this is why there needs to be supervision. Even if we were to take away the human equation, so suppose if right now we totally disappeared in the void. You mentioned games. Imagine a scenario like Horizon Zero Dawn.
Oh, wow.
Totally machines have taken over.
Yeah.
Well, to me, it is a very scary concept. But the reason why I think there still needs to be supervision is because at least if you were to study into artificial intelligence, its philosophy and computer science, it is still questionable whether, even if it becomes highly intelligent, it has that human component. It has that ghost in that machine. A very interesting idea is really what that is, what it means to be human. I think the French philosopher Descartes actually presented it brilliantly. He once said, how do we even know that we are real or life is real? And this is a question, of course, asked by Elon Musk. But Descartes, at least centuries ago, has asked this exact question. He said, you could imagine right now there could be a demon or devil playing a trick on you. And you could create a sense of reality, because after all, your sense of reality is through your sense of smell, sight, taste, everything, which is created in your mind. But what if a devil is actually simulating all these senses? So how would you even know your reality is real? How do we know this call right now is real? How do we know the person who's watching this, that you are not in a matrix? Well, Descartes said, of course you can't know. There's no way to know. Yet at the same time, you're thinking about it right now. I'm thinking about it. You're thinking about it. And the act of thinking means something is thinking beyond this entire picture. And that this thing that's thinking is actually potentially that ghost, at least a proof of our existence, that there is something in the background thinking critically. And therefore he said, cogito ergo sum, the idea that I think, therefore I am. But my point is this: machines can do so much, but do they have this active component in the background that is contemplating critically like the ways that humans do? And that is this component that's able to process more abstract things beyond command. If today I were a soldier and a general, and I was in a war, again, I hope not, but a general told me to kill a baby, that is an order. But yet there is perhaps a moral component in me that, again, philosophers and ethics have debated for centuries, and really millennia, of whether this is a universal thing. But there might be apprehensions, and certainly would be in me. But if a machine were to get the same instruction, it being so efficient, it could carry out easily. And that is something that is very interesting. I think that machines, at least why we should supervise their development, is that they lack this sort of human component, this consciousness, this criticality. They can be truly efficient and behave very intelligently, but whether they have this ability to make abstract but critical considerations and ultimately conclusions is something that I don't think they can develop, if at all, or if any time soon. They can, of course, appear very intelligent, have conversations with you, but totally lack this criticality. And this is a very interesting thing, which is why when you brought up the point of whether we should allow it to develop on its own, I think we should supervise it ultimately, at least from a point of what I've just mentioned, because again, it presents a lot of these questions really.
All right.
And we're seeing that really also in other areas of how it's applied in logistics, managing planes and managing other areas, because again, there still needs to be a human component, especially for some of the more critical decisions. There's been a lot of thought experiments being thought up by philosophers in this area. For example, imagine a self-driving car. It's lost control. And on the one hand, it might crash left and totally kill an adult person. On the other, a pregnant woman. Now, should it steer left or right? And these are really complex decisions that you cannot decide purely by data. You might think you could decide it quite efficiently by data, but of course it is a very moralistic question that even us humans, we are struggling to decide. And there's a question whether we should bring efficiency to that. An efficient answer would be, sure, veer to the one person that isn't pregnant. But again, that doesn't seem right to be able to make that decision so quickly, does it? And that is really, I think, the fascinating thing about the development of AI is just that no matter how efficient it becomes in processing data and utilizing data, it will always lack that criticality and the abstract nature of humans, which is potentially something that we should preserve,
right?
Even in the future, yeah.
Right. Interesting. You kind of mentioned a few things that which got my brain firing a few things, hearing what you just said.
Yeah, I think that's a very beautiful way of summing it up. And it's very interesting as well when you consider a lot of things that we've discussed. Thinking about intelligence, it isn't so much, I think, sometimes about just intelligence alone. There are actually bigger things at play. We can, of course, create all sorts of rules. You mentioned the movie iRobot, by the way, my mistake there. But iRobot, the idea that it's just following these three laws, the Asimov laws. Yeah. Now, even as us humans, we have rather clear laws, at least we like to think so. But again, in my past experience as a barrister, as a lawyer, you would understand in the legal world and in all these court cases, even applying laws are very, very complicated. In every different case, many different variables can actually make something that's seemingly so simple very complex. And to determine an ethical or at least a right outcome is a very complicated process. And certainly all this to not to say that we should be afraid of robots or AI as we're talking about, but is to say, yes, you're quite right. We should understand it better and we should understand what's going on and really participate in this conversation, especially in terms of how we develop and utilize AI. It is not to, and the reason why is because, again, its development is inevitable. Inevitable not just in its capability as a technology, but really in terms of the progression of society. It offers a lot of truly, truly progressive potential for us, economically speaking, and of course, even in a sociological sense. And so it is inevitable. We should embrace it and also participate in it, really to ebb its development. And that really should be the focus.
Yeah. And speaking of that, and I know we're kind of coming to the end of the show time as well,